The sun was setting behind the dusty hills when Jacob rode his tired horse back toward his small ranch. He was a middle-aged cowboy, quiet and kind, with lines on his face carved by years of wind and work. He had no family left, only the wide land and the cattle that gave him purpose. Life had grown silent since his wife passed away many years ago. The only sounds now were the creaking of the porch, the wind through the dry grass, and the soft steps of his old horse, Dusty, that evening. Jacob decided to stop by the town of Emporium to buy a few supplies, coffee, salt, and some nails for the fence. The small town had only one saloon, one store, and people who liked to talk more than they liked to listen. When he entered the saloon, the room was full of noise and laughter. His old friend Wade was there, loud as ever, telling stories about his travels and trading trips. Wade spotted Jacob and shouted, "Look who the desert brought in. Jacob, the quiet man who talks more to cows than people?" The men around laughed, and Jacob smiled politely. Sitting down at a corner table, he ordered a cup of coffee and watched the crowd. Wade kept drinking and talking, bragging about the things he had brought from the South: horses, blankets, and tools. Then the door opened again, and two men entered, pulling someone behind them. The saloon grew quiet as they stepped inside. It was a young Apache woman, her clothes worn and her hair dusty from travel. Her hands were tied with rope, and her face looked tired but proud. There was strength in her eyes, not fear. Wade stood up and grinned. "Look here, boys," he said. "The desert gave me a gift. A peace offering, maybe. She doesn't say much, but she's strong and quiet, just like our friend Jacob." Everyone laughed again, except Jacob. Jacob frowned. "What's this about, Wade?" he asked. Wade laughed louder. "She's yours, my friend. A gift. You live alone, don't you? Maybe she'll bring you luck. Maybe she'll help on the ranch." The men around them cheered and clapped, treating it like a joke. Jacob looked at the woman, who stood tall and silent, her eyes meeting his with calm defiance. He didn't see an object. He saw a person. He stood up slowly. "I don't want any gift like that," he said quietly. But Wade only grinned. "Come on, Jacob, don't be so serious. Think of it as kindness. You always say you need help on that old ranch of yours." Jacob shook his head. "You call this kindness?" Wade shrugged. "Then what do you want me to do with her? Leave her in the dust?" The woman's gaze never moved from Jacob's face. Her eyes said more than words could. She wasn't begging. She was waiting to see what kind of man he was. Jacob sighed and stepped forward. "Untie her," he said firmly. The room fell silent for a moment. Wade frowned. "You're crazy, Jacob. She'll run the second she's free." Jacob ignored him. "Untie her," he repeated. Reluctantly, one of the men loosened the rope. The woman rubbed her wrists, but didn't move. Jacob looked at her and said gently, "You can go. You're free." Wade burst out laughing. "Free out here. There's nowhere for her to go. You'll see she'll come crawling back to you before dawn." Jacob didn't answer. He took a deep breath and said to the woman, "You can come with me for the night. I have food and water. After that, you can go wherever you wish." The woman didn't speak, but gave a slow nod. They both left the saloon together, the laughter of the men echoing behind them. Outside, the air was cool, and the stars were already bright. The woman followed him quietly as they rode through the desert toward his ranch. The moonlight made her face look calm and strong, though her eyes still carried sadness. When they reached the small ranch, Jacob helped her down from the horse. "You can rest inside the guest shed," he said softly. "It's clean and warm." He gave her a blanket and pointed to the water barrel. She nodded and whispered her first words, "Thank you." Her voice was soft, but it carried strength. Jacob felt something heavy lift from his chest. That night, he sat on his porch, watching the stars. He thought about what had happened. He didn't know why he had stepped in, but something in him couldn't walk away. Maybe it was because of her eyes that didn't beg, only waited. They reminded him of his late wife's eyes, strong and unbroken even in sickness. The thought made him ache, but it also made him feel alive again. Inside the shed, the woman whose name he didn't yet know sat near the small fire Jacob had made for her. She looked around at the quiet land, the open sky, and the lonely man sitting on the porch. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. The next morning, Jacob woke to the sound of movement outside. When he stepped out, he saw the woman carrying water from the well. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked up at him and answered simply, "Work keeps me safe." Jacob didn't argue. He just nodded. Later that day, he offered her food, bread, beans, and coffee. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said softly, "Naya." He repeated it slowly, almost like a prayer. "Naya," he said, smiling a little. "That's a good name." Days passed and Naya stayed. She cleaned the small cabin, cooked simple meals, and even helped fix the fences. Jacob never asked her to do it, but she seemed to find comfort in work. One evening, after a long day, Jacob said, "You can leave whenever you want, Naya. You don't owe me anything." She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "I have nowhere to go. My people were taken far from here." Jacob didn't press her. Instead, he nodded and said quietly, "Then stay as long as you need." Weeks passed like this. Naya learned to tend to the horses and even laughed once or twice at the way Dusty, the horse, followed her around like a dog. Jacob noticed that laugh. It was soft, shy, but it made the quiet ranch feel alive again. Then one afternoon, clouds rolled in and the sky turned gray. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then stronger. Jacob stood under the porch, watching as Naya stepped into the rain, lifting her hands and face toward the sky. It was like she had been waiting for it. She smiled for the first time, truly smiled, as the rain soaked her hair and clothes. Jacob couldn't help but watch in silence. He walked toward her and said, "You really like the rain?" She turned and said softly, "It smells like home." Her words stayed with him long after the rain stopped. That night, Jacob sat by the fire, thinking about her. He had lived in silence for so long that he forgot what it was like to share space with another soul. Naya didn't talk much, but her presence was steady, like the land itself. She made the air feel different, warmer, lighter. He thought about how the men in town had laughed, how they had called her a gift, something to own. But she wasn't that. She was someone who had lost everything yet still stood tall. He admired that. As the firelight danced across the wooden walls, Jacob made a quiet promise to himself. He would help her find her people again, no matter how far they were. He didn't know how or when, but he knew it was the right thing to do. When he looked out through the window, he saw Naya asleep by the small fire near the barn, peaceful for the first time since she had arrived. The rain had washed away the dust, and the stars shone bright above the land. Jacob leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "Maybe she was never meant to be a gift. Maybe she was meant to be a second chance." Days turned into weeks, and Jacob's quiet ranch began to feel different. The empty silence that once filled his days was replaced by the sound of footsteps, laughter, and soft humming. Najee had become part of his daily life. She rose early every morning to gather water, feed the chickens, and prepare coffee before Jacob even woke up. When he stepped outside, he would often find her watching the sunrise. Her face peaceful as the first light touched the land. Jacob was not a man of many words, but he found himself speaking more each day, sometimes about weather, sometimes about the cattle, and sometimes about nothing at all, just to fill the air with something human. Naya listened quietly, answering with a smile or a short reply. She didn't talk much about her past, but Jacob could sense the pain that lingered behind her calm eyes. The townsfolk began to notice her too. Whenever Jacob rode into town for supplies, Naya went along to help carry things. Some people looked at her kindly, others with suspicion. A few whispered behind their hands. One man said, "Ain't right, bringing her here." Another muttered, "She'll bring trouble." Jacob ignored them. He wasn't about to explain to anyone that kindness didn't need permission. One day, at the general store, the shopkeeper's wife asked Naya gently, "Do you miss your home?" Naya smiled politely and said, "Home is where someone treats you fair." Jacob didn't say a word, but his heart warmed at her answer. Back at the ranch, their days followed a quiet rhythm. Jacob taught Naya how to saddle a horse, how to mend fences, and how to guide cattle through narrow trails. She learned fast, her hands strong and steady. Sometimes she would teach him words from her language, laughing when he pronounced them wrong. Slowly, the bond between them grew, not as master and servant, not as strangers, but as two people finding peace in each other's presence. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in gold and red, Wade and his men appeared again at the ranch. Jacob was repairing the corral fence when he saw dust rising in the distance. His horse lifted its head, uneasy. Wade's laughter came before his words. "Well, look at that," he shouted as he rode up. "You really kept her, huh? Guess I was right, old man." Jacob's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Wade?" Wade shrugged. "Just checking on my old friend. Seems like you've gone soft. Living out here with your new helper?" His tone was mocking, but his eyes held a hint of something sharper. "You should be thanking me, Jacob. I gave you company." Jacob stood tall, his face calm but firm. "You didn't give me anything? She's not something to give." The air grew heavy. Wade's smile faded. "You sure you want to talk like that, Jacob?" Jacob didn't move. "You've said enough. Leave." Wade glanced at Naya, who was standing near the barn door. Her posture was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Wade gave a slow smirk. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. People in town don't like surprises like this." Then he turned his horse and rode off with his men, leaving a trail of dust behind. That night, Jacob sat on the porch, deep in thought. Naya came over and placed a cup of warm coffee beside him. "They won't come back," she said quietly. Jacob looked at her. "Maybe not, but if they do, they'll find I'm not scared of them." She smiled faintly and said, "You're not scared of anyone." Jacob chuckled. "I'm scared of being alone again." Her expression softened. For a long time, they sat without words, watching the stars appear one by one. A few days later, something strange happened. While Naya was collecting firewood near the hills, she stopped suddenly. A faint sound echoed from faraway drums, slow, steady, and distant. She froze, her heart racing. She knew that rhythm. It was from her people. She dropped the wood and ran back toward the ranch. "Jacob," she called. He came out of the barn, surprised to see her breathless. "What's wrong?" She pointed toward the horizon. "I heard them, my people. They're near." Jacob didn't hesitate. "Then let's go." Within minutes, they saddled the horses and rode into the fading light. The sound grew stronger as they crossed dry valleys and narrow ridges. After nearly an hour, they reached a canyon hidden behind tall rocks. Their fires burned low, and shadows moved among tents. Naya's breath caught. She called out in her native language, and several figures turned. Then she heard a cry a woman's voice and saw an older woman running toward her. It was her mother. They embraced tightly, tears streaming down both their faces. Jacob stayed back, giving them space. Soon others gathered around, curious about the stranger. Naya explained who Jacob was, how he had treated her kindly, how he had helped her survive when she had nowhere to go. The elders listened quietly. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, approached Jacob and said through Naya's translation, "You returned what others took. You gave respect where there was none. The land remembers such hearts." Jacob bowed his head humbly. "She saved me too," he said softly. Though Naya didn't translate those words, they invited him to stay for food. Around the fire, Naya laughed with the children and spoke freely with her people. Jacob had never seen her so alive, so bright. Watching her, he realized something. He had found joy not in keeping her close, but in seeing her free. When the meal ended, Naya walked with him to the edge of the canyon. The stars shone above them. "Will you go back to your ranch?" she asked. Jacob nodded slowly. "It's home. Quiet, but it's mine." She looked down, then said softly, "You gave me a home when I had none. I won't forget." He smiled gently. "You owe me nothing, Naya. You just live free. That's all I want." The next morning, before he left, the tribe's chief gave Jacob a woven blanket, made by Naya and her mother during the night. "To remind you that kindness never fades," Naya said as she handed it to him. Jacob touched the blanket and said, "I'll keep it always." He rode away slowly, the sun rising behind him. The air smelled of sage and smoke. He didn't look back until he reached the ridge. Naya stood there, waving. He raised his hat in return, then disappeared into the horizon. Days later, Jacob returned to his quiet ranch, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. The blanket hung on the porch rail, a symbol of peace and friendship. Every morning, when he drank his coffee, he looked at it and smiled. Sometimes, he thought he could still hear her humming in the wind. Weeks passed. One afternoon, as Jacob fixed the barn door, he heard hooves approaching. He turned and saw Naya riding toward him. She was smiling, holding a basket of herbs and food. "You came back," Jacob said, surprised but happy. She nodded. "My people are safe now. But I miss the quiet here." They sat together under the porch, sharing stories, laughing gently at his clumsy attempts to speak her words again. It wasn't romance. It was something deeper: trust, care, and understanding. Two souls from different worlds finding warmth and kindness. The townsfolk still whispered when they saw them together.
At.
But Jacob didn't care. He had learned something simple but powerful. People could say what they wanted, but goodness needed no explanation. Every sunset after that, Jacob and Naya would sit side by side, watching the sky turn to gold. The land was still the same, but life felt different, softer, fuller, and alive again. And though the world had called her a gift, both of them knew the truth. Naya was never anyone's gift. She was her own spirit, strong, free, and bright as the desert morning. But to Jacob, she became something precious all the same. The reminder that even the loneliest heart could be healed by a single act of kindness.